Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to have you join me by the fire tonight. Tell me, has a letter ever sat unopened upon your desk, its fold catching the lamplight just so? Watson learned that even a crease in paper may hold a truth its wax seal was meant to guard. Do subscribe, that no fold, no fire, no quiet clue escapes you. Now, draw nearer. For as Holmes himself observed, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Find us also on Spotify, dear friends. The link awaits you in the description below. Chapter 1. The White Road to Blackthorn Hall. It has been remarked by those who have done me the honour of reading my earlier chronicles that the severest winters seem always to have thrown my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes into his keenest activity, as though the frost itself sharpened some faculty in him that warmer seasons left dormant. I can recall no season, in all the years of our association, so pitiless as that of which I now write, when London lay for the better part of a fortnight beneath a shroud of snow, and the very cab-horses stood shivering and steaming in the mews for want of custom. It was upon such an evening, with the fire burning low and Holmes stretched upon the sofa in that attitude of studied idleness which I had long since learned to distrust, that Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor whose boots, she informed us with some asperity, had deposited a considerable quantity of half-melted snow upon her hall carpet. The gentleman who entered was perhaps 35, spare of frame, with the pallor of a man who has spent long hours indoors among ledgers and deeds. His name, he informed us, was Adrian Bellamy, and he held the position of solicitor to a firm engaged in the recovery of commercial debts. He seated himself at Holmes's invitation, though he seemed unable to keep his hands entirely still, and I observed that he glanced more than once toward the window, as though he feared to be followed even to our door. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have come to you because I do not know where else a man might turn when he suspects that a secret known to but two persons has somehow become known to a third, without either of those two persons having betrayed it." "That is a promising beginning," said Holmes, opening his eyes. "Pray continue, and omit nothing, however trivial it may appear to you." Bellamy explained that he was engaged upon a mission of some delicacy. A writ of attachment had been issued against certain property belonging to one Sir Claudius Vale, of Blackthorn Hall, a remote estate upon the northern edge of Derbyshire. The property in question was a collection of Flemish tapestries of considerable antiquity and value, which Sir Claudius had pledged as security against a debt now in dispute before the courts. Should the writ be served, the tapestries would pass into the custody of the law until judgment was given. Should it fail, or be delayed, Sir Claudius would be at liberty to remove them beyond the court's reach. The writ itself, Bellamy went on, was drawn only 2 days since, and I carried it from the clerk's hand directly to my own dispatch case. I give you my word, Mr. Holmes, that no living soul knew I carried it, save the issuing clerk and myself. Yet I confess to an uneasiness I cannot explain, a sense, if you will permit so unloyally a word, that I am expected. Holmes regarded him with that quick, appraising glance which I had seen him turn upon 100 clients, a glance that seemed to take in not merely the words spoken but the manner of their speaking. "You are travelling to Blackthorn Hall today?" "Within the hour, if the trains permit it. I had hoped to reach Derbyshire before the storm closed the line, but I fear I have left it dangerously late." "And you wish me to accompany you?" I had not dared to ask so much, but if you would consent, Watson too, of course, if the doctor is willing, I should feel very much easier. Holmes was silent a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You say that no one could have learned of the writ save yourself and the clerk, and yet you fear that someone at Blackthorn Hall already knows. That is not, upon its face, a legal problem, Mr. Bellamy. It is a problem in the leakage of secrets, which is a subject upon which I flatter myself I have some small expertise. Watson, I think we have time to pack a bag before the 4:15. Whatever doubts I may privately have entertained regarding a journey into the teeth of such weather were overborne, as they so often were, by my curiosity to see what manner of mystery lay concealed beneath so simple a commission. It seemed to me, as our train drew out of St. Pancras into a whirl of driving snow, that we were embarked upon nothing more than the quiet delivery of a legal document. I had learned, however, from long experience, that Holmes rarely troubled himself over documents alone. The journey northward was a slow and melancholy business. Twice our train was delayed by drifts upon the line, and by the time we descended at the small station nearest Blackthorn Hall, the last grey light of afternoon was fading into a blue and bitter dusk. A hired sleigh, procured with some difficulty, bore us the remaining miles across a countryside already vanishing beneath the storm, the hedgerows reduced to soft white mounds, the road itself a matter more of memory than of sight for our shivering driver. Blackthorn Hall stood in a hollow of the moor, its grey gables rising above a screen of leafless elms, its windows glowing dimly through the thickening snow. The gates, when we reached them, were already half buried, and as I glanced behind us I saw that the track by which we had come was fast disappearing, the wind smoothing it into the surrounding whiteness as though we had never passed that way at all. It was, I confess, an image that lingered unpleasantly in my mind, that the house before us and the world behind us were, from that hour, quite cut off from one another. We were received in a hall of considerable antiquity, warmed by a fire of logs, and there assembled to greet us, with a promptness that struck even my unobservant eye as curious in a household presumably unwarned of our coming, the small company whom the storm had gathered under that roof. Sir Claudius Vale himself came forward first, a heavy, courteous man whose handsome features bore the marks of recent anxiety. Beside him stood his widowed sister, Lady Honora Bligh, dark-eyed and composed, Mr. Edmund Rusk, his secretary, thin and quick of movement, Dr. Elias Merrow, the family physician, grey-whiskered and deliberate, Miss Clara Fenwick, a young woman who served as companion to Lady Honora, and who seemed to me paler than the occasion alone would account for, and Mr. Silas Trent, the estate steward, a solid, weathered man with the look of one long accustomed to outdoor labour. Each received Bellamy's introduction, and mine, and that of my celebrated companion, with a civility so uniform, so evenly measured, that I might almost have suspected it rehearsed, had such a notion not seemed absurd in the circumstances. Not one of them professed the smallest curiosity as to the purpose of Bellamy's journey, and it was this very absence of curiosity, natural enough perhaps in 6 persons determined to observe the forms of hospitality toward a storm-bound stranger, which I later came to understand had struck Holmes as the first false note in an otherwise faultless performance. We were shown to our rooms that we might repair the ravages of our journey before dinner. It was there, as I stood before the fire beating the snow from my coat, that Holmes, who had followed me in, spoke the words that first told me this was to be no ordinary visit. "Watson," said he quietly, "did you observe the boots?" The boots? 6 persons came forward to welcome a snowbound stranger into their hall this evening. 5 of the 6 looked, however briefly, at the snow upon Bellamy's boots. A natural enough glance, I grant you, at a man newly come in from such a night. But the 6th did not look at his boots at all. The 6th looked, from the very first moment, at his dispatch case. Chapter 2. A Respectable Company. Dinner was served in a long panelled room hung with the portraits of Vale ancestors, whose stern painted eyes seemed to me that evening to preside over the table with a scrutiny scarcely less keen than that of my companion. The meal itself was excellent, the wine well chosen, and the conversation flowed with the polished ease of a household long accustomed to entertaining. And yet beneath that surface I detected, as the courses passed, a strain that no amount of civility could wholly conceal. Sir Claudius spoke with a frankness that surprised me, given the circumstances of our visit. He alluded openly to his financial embarrassments, laying the blame for the disputed debt upon a former business partner, whose conduct, he assured us, had been little short of fraudulent. The tapestries, he insisted, were heirlooms that had hung in that hall since the days of the second Charles, and no court in England, however justly moved, ought to strip a family of its history for the sake of a merchant's ledger. "You will forgive me, Mr. Bellamy," said he with a smile that did not entirely reach his eyes, "if I confess that I take no pleasure in your errand, whatever it may prove to be." Bellamy, for his part, said little of his business, and it was arranged, with Sir Claudius's ready consent, that the leather dispatch case containing the writ should be placed for safety in the library safe. This precaution seemed to me, I confess, rather an excess of caution than a necessity, since the case was locked and the household, whatever its private feelings, appeared entirely respectable. Holmes, however, watched the small ceremony of its bestowal with an attention that told me he regarded it otherwise. The safe itself stood behind a carved wooden panel in the library wall, and required, we were told, 2 keys for its opening. One carried always by Sir Claudius upon a chain beneath his waistcoat, the other held by Mr. Trent, the steward, whose office it was to guard against any single person tampering with the contents unwitnessed. Both keys were produced and shown to us that evening, a display of candour which Bellamy seemed to find reassuring, and which I confess reassured me also. The remainder of the evening passed upon the surface in perfect tranquillity. Lady Honora sat near the drawing-room fire with her embroidery, the needle moving with a steadiness that bespoke long habit. Rusk excused himself early to attend to correspondence in the study. Dr. Merrow was summoned to a servant taken with fever, and did not rejoin us. Clara read aloud to Lady Honora from a volume of poetry, her voice pleasant but, I thought, a shade too carefully controlled. Trent went out into the storm to see that the outbuildings were secured, returning with his coat white and his cheeks reddened by the cold. It was, in short, an evening of unexceptionable domesticity, and had I been alone, I should have retired that night with no thought in my head beyond the excellence of Sir Claudius's port. But Holmes was not so easily satisfied. I observed him more than once rise from his chair upon some trifling pretext, and wander, apparently at random, about the ground floor of the house. And when at last we withdrew to the library before bed, he drew my attention to certain matters which had, until that moment, entirely escaped me. "You will have noticed," said he, standing before the library window with his hands clasped behind him, "the melted patch upon the snow beneath this sill." I confessed that I had not. A faint rectangle, Watson, no more, as though some object, warmer than its surroundings, had rested there and been withdrawn. It may mean nothing. A gardener's lantern, perhaps, set down and taken up again. And yet, he turned from the window to the corridor without, where a single candle burned in its sconce. That candle was lit an hour ago, freshly trimmed, though no one has passed this way since dinner that I have observed. Someone trims a candle who expects to need it again shortly. He crossed then to the hearth, where a brass fire screen stood before the cold grate, and studied it with a curiosity I found almost comic, so ordinary did the object appear. And this screen, my dear fellow, is turned inward upon a fire that has not been lit today. Why should anyone trouble to adjust a screen before an empty grate? I own that I could make nothing of these observations, and said as much, whereupon Holmes only smiled and remarked that a fact, without significance today, might prove the very keystone of tomorrow's argument. It was a sentiment I had heard from him before, upon 100 occasions, and I had learned neither to dispute it, nor, I confess, to attach to it at the time the weight it generally deserved. The storm, meanwhile, had been steadily worsening, and shortly before 11 we received confirmation from a white-faced footman that the telephone line to the village had failed. The rear doors, swollen with damp and frozen fast in their frames, could no longer be opened at all, and when I looked out upon the drive, I saw that the snow lay smooth and unbroken from the house to the farthest hedge, without so much as a bird's track to mar its surface. We were, in the fullest sense, cut off, no one able to leave Blackthorn Hall, and, as it seemed then, no one able to approach it unseen. Before retiring, Bellamy insisted upon satisfying himself that his charge remained secure, and Sir Claudius conducted him, with Trent in attendance, to the library, where the 2 keys were produced once more and the safe opened. The dispatch case lay within precisely as it had been left. Bellamy locked the safe again with his own eyes upon the operation, thanked our host, and came away visibly easier in his mind. I remember that I slept but poorly that night, disturbed by the moaning of the wind about the gables and by a vague uneasiness I could not then have named. Holmes, when I looked in upon him before seeking my own bed, was sitting fully dressed beside his window, watching the snow fall upon a world already white beyond recognition, and he did not turn his head when I bade him good night. Chapter 3. The Empty Dispatch Case. I was roused a little before 7 the following morning by a cry that carried through the sleeping house with a force I had not thought that quiet establishment capable of producing. It was Bellamy's voice, and there was in it a note of such raw dismay that I was out of bed and into my dressing gown before I had fully shaken off the confusion of sleep. I found him in the library, standing before the open panel in the wall, his face the colour of the snow that still pressed against the windows. The safe stood unlocked, its door swung wide, and upon the carpet before it lay his dispatch case, the lid thrown back, its leather sides gaping like the shell of some creature from which the living part had been drawn. "Gone," said he as I entered. "Mr. Holmes, doctor, it is gone." Holmes, who had followed close upon my heels, crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the case without a word. Within lay Bellamy's notebook, a packet of correspondence, and the seals he had carried for the authentication of documents. Of the writ of attachment itself there was no trace whatsoever. The lock of the case, I observed, bore no mark of violence, no scratch, no wrenched hasp, nothing to suggest that force had been employed in its opening. Sir Claudius arrived within a few minutes, in considerable disorder of dress, and produced from beneath his waistcoat the key which he wore always upon its chain, offering it to Bellamy's inspection with an eagerness that struck me, even in the confusion of the moment, as somewhat overdone. Trent was sent for, and came hurrying from his own quarters to report that his key remained precisely where it had lain all night, in a cabinet secured by a second lock, the cabinet key itself tied about his wrist by a cord which he now displayed, still knotted, as proof that he had not stirred from his room unobserved. It was at this juncture that Inspector Harcourt presented himself, a provincial officer of the county constabulary, who had, by good fortune or ill, been detained at a neighbouring village by the very storm that now held us all prisoner, and who had reached Blackthorn Hall only the previous afternoon, upon some errand connected with a poaching case. He was a burly, confident man, not without ability of a certain narrow kind, and he set about his examination of the library with an air that suggested he did not anticipate the matter would long detain him. 2 keys, and 2 keys only, said he, when he had heard the particulars, one in Sir Claudius's own keeping, the other never out of Mr. Trent's cabinet. It follows, gentlemen, that one or other of these 2 persons opened that safe last night, whatever face may be put upon it now. And he glanced as he spoke towards Sir Claudius with a significance that none of us could mistake. The circumstantial evidence, I must own, appeared to support him. Upon the carpet beside the empty case lay a scattering of ash from the distinctive Turkish cigarettes which Sir Claudius alone, of all the household, was known to smoke, and when Harcourt examined our host's coat sleeve, he drew from it a fragment of red sealing ribbon of the sort used to bind legal documents. A housemaid, questioned as to the night's events, recalled, with the hesitant manner of a servant reluctant to speak against her master, that she had seen a thread of light beneath the library door a little after midnight. Sir Claudius protested his innocence with what seemed to me genuine heat, though I have learned, in the course of my association with Holmes, how poor a guide mere sincerity of manner can be to the truth of a matter. He could not or would not account for the ash and the ribbon, beyond a general and somewhat helpless assertion that he had no notion how they came to be there. Holmes, throughout this exchange, had said scarcely a word. He moved about the library with that quiet, unhurried attention, which I had come to recognise as the truest sign of his interest, examining the safe, the carpet, the window, the very hearth rug, with a thoroughness that Harcourt plainly regarded as an eccentric indulgence rather than a serious method of inquiry. At length, he turned to the company and asked, in a tone so mild that I think none but I appreciated its importance, whether the library fire had been lit at any hour during the night. The answer, given without hesitation by more than one voice, was that it had not. The grate had stood cold since the previous afternoon, the household having no cause to warm a room already vacated for the night. Then perhaps, said Holmes, someone will explain to me the presence of soot upon the upper surface of this fire screen. He indicated as he spoke the tall brass screen which I had noticed him examining the evening before, and which now stood, as it had stood then, with its ornamented face turned inward toward the cold hearth. Harcourt, stooping to look, allowed with some impatience that a trace of soot was indeed visible along the screen's upper edge, though he could not see what significance the doctor, for so he insisted upon styling my friend in a tone not wholly free of condescension, attached to so trivial a smear. "It is this, Inspector," said Holmes. "A fire screen, standing in its accustomed place before a hearth, receives its soot, if any, upon the face turned toward the fire, the inner face which over months and years grows blackened by the smoke of many a comfortable evening. The outer face, turned always toward the room, remains comparatively clean. Here we have the reverse, soot upon the surface now presented to the room, and the inner face, the face which should be blackened, clean as the day it was cast. There is but one explanation. This screen has been taken up, turned about, and set down again, its sooted face now offered to us, as though it had always stood so." Harcourt received this observation with the tolerant smile of a busy man humouring a fancy he considers beside the point, and returned at once to his theory of Sir Claudius's guilt. Holmes said nothing further, but I, who knew him, saw that he was very far from finished with the matter of the fire screen, and that behind his silence some deeper reckoning was already taking shape. Chapter 4. The Footprints That Were Not There. The snow beyond the library window lay, as I've said, unbroken from the sill to the distant hedge, save for a single shallow depression immediately beneath the glass, which Harcourt, upon first noticing it, dismissed with the confidence of a man who has already settled the question in his own mind. "Snow falling from the roof above," said he, with a wave of the hand. "You will find such marks under any window in a house of this age, after a night's storm." Holmes, however, was not a man to accept an explanation merely because it was convenient, and he knelt in the drift beneath the sill with a tape measure and a small trowel of the sort he habitually carried upon such expeditions, working with a patience that left his knees soaked through, and his temper, so far as I could judge, entirely unaffected. When at last he rose, he had a fact to offer that Harcourt could not so readily wave aside. "A fall of snow from a roof," said Holmes, "produces a mark irregular in outline, deepest at its centre, and shading gradually to nothing at its edges, precisely as one would expect of a mass striking soft snow from a height. This depression, Inspector, is rectangular, its edges are straight and sharply so, as though some object of regular form had rested here and been withdrawn, rather than fallen and scattered." Harcourt examined the mark again, with rather more attention than before, but professed himself unconvinced that so small a distinction signified anything at all. The window itself, he pointed out, was latched securely from within, its frost undisturbed upon the panes, and no footprint of any kind approached it across that unbroken field of white. Whatever had made the mark, it could not, in his view, be connected with any person passing in or out. It was here that Holmes advanced an argument which I confess struck me at the time as more ingenious than convincing. You reason, Inspector, that because no footprints cross the snow, nothing has passed through this window. I would put it to you that the absence of footprints proves only that no one has crossed the snow since it settled into its present form. It does not prove that nothing passed through the window before the snow had ceased to fall, or that nothing was lowered to rest upon it and withdrawn again, while the storm yet continued to cover any trace of the operation. I own that this seemed to me, upon first hearing, a distinction too fine to bear much weight, and yet I had learned, over the years, that Holmes's finest distinctions were generally those which proved, in the end, to bear the whole edifice of his argument. Within the room itself his search uncovered 3 further particulars, each trifling in isolation, each, as I was to learn, a thread in a pattern not yet visible to me. The first was a curtain tassel, one of a pair that hung to either side of the library window, which drooped some inches lower than its fellow, as though its cord had been strained or its weight disturbed. The second was a narrow scratch upon the inner sill, fresh enough that the wood beneath showed pale against the surrounding varnish. The third, and to my mind the strangest, was a single page torn cleanly from the household timetable that hung, in the manner of such establishments, upon a board in the servants' passage, a page recording, as we later learned, the movements ordinarily expected of the staff during the hour before midnight. It was at this point that a discovery was made which threatened for a time to render all Holmes's careful reasoning superfluous. A footman, raking out the ashes of the dining-room grate, came upon a quantity of charred paper thrust hastily among the embers of a fire that had, unlike the libraries, been allowed to burn the previous evening, and among the fragments, still legible despite the scorching, appeared a portion of a word, the letters "achment," plainly the remnant of attachment, in a hand and upon a paper that seemed, to Harcourt's eye at least, entirely consistent with a legal document such as the one we sought. Sir Claudius, confronted with this new evidence, admitted with evident reluctance that he had indeed entered the library a little before midnight, though he protested that his purpose had been innocent. He had gone, he said, only to consult a volume of family records kept upon the library shelves, a habit of some years' standing whenever sleeplessness pressed upon him. This admission served at once to explain, in Harcourt's satisfied estimation, both the cigarette ash beside the dispatch case and the ribbon caught upon his sleeve, and the charred fragment taken together with these seemed to complete a case that required no further elaboration. "There is your writ, Mr. Holmes," said Harcourt, not without a certain satisfaction in his voice, "burned by the very man who stood to lose most by its service. I think we need look no further." Holmes, however, had taken the charred fragment between his fingers and was studying it beneath his pocket lens with an attention that seemed to me, given Harcourt's evident conviction, almost perverse. "The paper is a good deal thicker than that upon which Mr. Bellamy's writ was engrossed," said he at last, "and its colour, where the scorching has not entirely destroyed it, inclines to a blue a shade darker than the document I examined in London before we set out. I do not say this proves Sir Claudius innocent of every impropriety. A man may enter a library at midnight for reasons other than theft, and burn a paper for reasons other than the destruction of evidence. But I'm tolerably confident, Inspector, that whatever was burned in that grate last night, it was not the writ of attachment." Harcourt received this correction with the air of a man who regards a difference of shade in scorched paper as beneath serious consideration, and I confess that I myself was inclined, for the moment, to share something of his impatience. It was only later, when the full pattern of that strange night came at last to light, that I understood Holmes had that afternoon secured the first fact in the case of which he felt entirely certain, and that a false clue, cunningly laid, had very nearly succeeded in its purpose. Chapter 5. What the Eye had witnessed. Having satisfied himself, at least in his own mind, upon the matter of the charred fragment, Holmes turned his attention that afternoon to the household itself and asked Sir Claudius's leave to speak with each member of the company in turn. It was granted readily enough, though I thought I detected, in more than one face about that troubled table, a shadow of apprehension that no amount of composure could quite banish. I had expected, from long familiarity with Holmes's methods, that these interviews would proceed by way of searching question and careful cross-examination, after the fashion Harcourt himself employed with such evident relish in the morning-room. I was mistaken. Holmes asked few questions of any consequence, and listened to the answers he did receive with an inattention that would have offended me, had I not understood that his true examination was proceeding elsewhere, in the folds of a sleeve, the dust upon a hem, the particular stain of ink upon a finger. Lady Honora was seen first, and gave her account with the composure of a woman long practised in the management of a household, and I suspected of her own countenance besides. She had remained, she said, beside the drawing-room fire until close upon midnight, occupied with her embroidery, and had retired directly to her room without pause. Holmes thanked her with every appearance of satisfaction, and it was only as she rose to leave that his eye fell, apparently by chance, upon the hem of her gown, where a faint pale dust clung to the dark fabric in a manner scarcely visible, save to an eye trained to seek such things. "You will forgive my curiosity, Lady Honora," said he, "but that dust upon your hem, plaster, I think, and not the ordinary dust of a well-kept house. Have you had occasion to pass along the staircase? I understand it has been closed these several weeks for repair." She coloured a little, though whether from confusion or mere surprise at the question I could not tell, and answered after the briefest hesitation that Clara had perhaps brushed against her in fetching a shawl, and that the dust might have passed between them in that manner. Holmes accepted the explanation with a bow that gave nothing of his own opinion away, though I, watching him, felt tolerably certain he had accepted nothing of the kind. Clara herself, when her turn came, proved a poor witness in the sense that her manner betrayed a nervousness her words did their best to contradict. She insisted, with rather more emphasis than the simple fact required, that she had not left the drawing-room the whole evening through, and it was only when Holmes, in the course of some quite unrelated remark, took her hand for a moment as though to examine a ring she wore, that he observed, and drew my attention to afterward, though he had said nothing of it at the time, that her left cuff was damp to the touch, while her right remained perfectly dry, as though she had lately carried something cold pressed close against one arm and not the other. Dr. Merrow received us in a manner altogether more brusque, being, I think, a man who resented the imputation that his time upon a sick-bed vigil required any accounting. He had sat with the fevered servant, he said, until 12:30, and could produce the girl herself, did we wish it, in confirmation. Holmes did not press him upon this point, but asked instead, with every appearance of professional interest, to see the contents of his medical bag, a request Merrow granted with some impatience, plainly regarding it as an irrelevant curiosity. Among the ordinary instruments of his calling, Holmes's eye fell upon a reel of fine surgical cord, from which, I observed as he turned it in his fingers, a considerable length was plainly missing. Merrow, questioned upon the point, denied with some heat that he had put the cord to any use beyond his usual practice, though he could not explain how so much of it came to be gone. Rusk, the secretary, proved a more difficult subject, being a man of quick and guarded intelligence who answered every question, with a precision that left nothing for Holmes to seize upon directly. Yet even here the hands told a story the tongue withheld. His fingers bore the ordinary ink stains of a man much occupied with correspondence, and yet, as Holmes pointed out to me afterward, the thumb of his right hand, which any man accustomed to writing employs constantly to steady the paper beneath his pen, remained conspicuously clean, while the fingers about it were freely marked. It was, Holmes said, the hand not of a man who had spent the evening writing, but of one who had spent it handling papers already written, sorting them, perhaps, or comparing one against another with a care that kept the thumb itself withdrawn from the ink. Trent, last of the company to be examined, presented himself with the stolid unconcern of a man who feels himself under no suspicion whatever, and indeed his account of the evening, securing the outbuildings against the storm, retiring early to his own quarters, seemed the least remarkable of any we had heard. His boots, when Holmes's glance fell upon them, were clean enough, the outdoor mud long since brushed away. But upon the heel of the left boot, the small brass plate that protected it from wear showed a bright and recent scrape, such as might be made by a sudden slip upon stone. Trent, when asked, explained readily enough that he had slipped in the stone passage near the pantry while carrying a lamp, and thought no more of it. When at last the interviews were concluded, Holmes drew me aside into the empty morning room, and stood for some moments before the window, watching the snow that continued without pause or pity to bury the world beyond the glass. "You will have observed, Watson," said he at length, "that every person in this house has given an account of their evening that is, upon its face, entirely reasonable, and that not one of those accounts can be proved false by any word spoken. And yet their garments, the dust, the damp cuff, the missing cord, the clean thumb, the scraped heel, speak with a candour their tongues have carefully withheld. I do not yet know the whole of what occurred in this house last night, but I am now quite certain of one thing. It was not the act of a single guilty man working alone and unassisted. It was the act, Watson, of several respectable people who have agreed among themselves, whether from loyalty, from fear, or from some motive I have not yet divined, to tell the same convenient lie. Chapter 6. The Missing Quarter Hour. It was not until the following morning, the second of our enforced sojourn at Blackthorn Hall, that Holmes turned his full attention to the torn page of the household timetable which he had found upon the library floor, a discovery which he had, until then, mentioned to me only in passing, as though reluctant to build too much upon so slight a foundation. The board upon which the timetable hung was kept, I learned, in the servants' passage, and recorded, after the manner of well-regulated country houses, the ordinary succession of duties expected of the staff throughout the evening hours: the extinguishing of lamps in the several reception rooms, the locking of doors, the final round made by the senior footman to satisfy himself that all was secure before the household retired. Holmes procured, with Sir Claudius's rather uneasy permission, the housekeeper's own duplicate of this schedule, and compared it sheet by sheet against the torn remnant still pinned to the board. "Here," said he, laying the two before me upon the library table, "you will observe a discrepancy the housekeeper's copy makes plain, though the board itself, in its mutilated state, conceals it entirely. The original timetable allowed a full quarter of an hour between the extinguishing of the drawing-room lamps and the footman's final inspection of the corridors, a natural enough interval, given the distances to be covered in a house of this size. It is precisely that page, Watson, recording that interval, which has been torn away." The significance of this was not lost upon me, dull as I had proved myself in most matters connected with the case. During those 15 minutes, whatever they had contained, no servant's testimony could establish where any member of the household had been, or what any one of them had been doing. And it was into this convenient gap, as Holmes now set himself to demonstrate, that the true history of that night's events had been carefully folded away. He spent the better part of the morning in quiet inquiry, a word here with a housemaid, a glance there at an old ledger of household accounts, a conversation with the gardener regarding certain packing cases stored in an outbuilding, and by the time we sat down together after luncheon, he had assembled, piece by piece, a history of the Vale family's fortunes that went far beyond anything Bellamy himself had thought to mention. "Lady Honora," said he, "invested no small sum, some years since, in the same commercial enterprise whose failure now threatens her brother with ruin. Dr. Merrow, I find, once signed certificates of ill health that served very conveniently to postpone an earlier stage of these same legal proceedings. Rusk, in his character as secretary, prepared correspondence intended to suggest, falsely I am now persuaded, that the tapestries had already passed into the hands of a foreign purchaser, beyond the reach of any English court, and Trent, the steward, arranged only 2 days since for a quantity of packing cases to be brought in from the estate's outbuildings, though no one in the household will admit to having ordered them. I confess that as he laid these facts before me one by one, I began to perceive the shape of a conspiracy far more extensive than any I had at first imagined. Not the act of a single desperate man, but the concerted effort of an entire household, bound together, as Holmes had surmised the evening before, by something other than mere self-interest. Their motive, I think, Holmes continued, was not greed, Watson, but loyalty, a loyalty perhaps misguided, but not upon that account dishonourable. Each of these persons owes Sir Claudius some debt of gratitude or affection that the law does not recognise, and each, I believe, agreed to play some small part in delaying the service of Bellamy's writ, long enough for the tapestries to be moved beyond the court's immediate reach. It was never their intention, I am now convinced, that the writ itself should be stolen outright, only concealed or its service postponed until the more pressing business of removal had been accomplished. He proceeded then to sketch, with that patient thoroughness I had so often admired in him, the part each conspirator had played during the missing quarter hour. Lady Honora, he believed, had passed along the disused east staircase, hence the plaster dust upon her hem, in order to reach some point of vantage or communication not otherwise accessible from the drawing-room. Clara had carried, wrapped in cloth against the drawing-room's warmth, a block of ice taken from the estate's own stores, hence the damp cuff that had betrayed her. The ice held close against one arm while the other remained free. Doctor Merrow had supplied from his own surgical stores the length of cord that Holmes had noted missing from his bag. Trent had opened, at some point during that same brief interval, a small ventilating hatch let into the library wall, of a kind common enough in houses of that age, meant to draw off the damp that so easily gathers in rooms lined with old panelling. And Rusk, said Holmes, altered the timetable itself, tearing away the single page that might have exposed the gap in which all this activity took place. But Holmes, said I, turning these particulars over in my mind with growing bewilderment, if ice and cord and an open hatch were all employed toward some purpose connected with that window, surely this brings us back to the very depression in the snow you examined yesterday, the rectangular mark that Harcourt was so ready to dismiss. It does indeed, Watson, and I think we begin now to understand its origin. A weighted box, lowered from that hatch by means of the missing cord, resting for a time upon snow not yet thickened by the night's later fall, would leave precisely such a mark, its edges sharp and regular, for a box has corners where a falling mass of snow has none. As the ice packed about it slowly melted, the box would settle deeper into the drift, and the succeeding snowfall would complete the illusion of a surface never disturbed at all. Together, these facts, laid end to end, described a conspiracy whose purpose seemed at last entirely intelligible. A household united to buy time for its master by the ancient and harmless expedient of appearing to know nothing whatever. And yet Holmes, even as he set the pieces before me with such evident satisfaction, was careful to add a caution that I did not at the time fully appreciate. I would have you remember, Watson, that a conspiracy to delay is not the same thing as a conspiracy to steal. These good people, whatever their faults, agreed among themselves to hide a writ, not to make away with it beyond recovery. Somewhere in this household, I am now persuaded, there is a person who watched this amiable scheme take shape, and saw in it not an act of family loyalty to be shared, but an opportunity to be seized alone. Chapter 7. The Writ in the Ice House. The third morning of our imprisonment at Blackthorn Hall broke grey and still, the storm at last spending itself against a sky the colour of dull pewter, and it was into this uneasy calm that Trent came hurrying from the direction of the outbuildings, with news that set the whole household astir. The missing writ, he declared, had been found. It lay, he told us, within the estate's ice house, that low turf-covered structure sunk into the rising ground behind the stables, where the household supply of ice was kept packed in sawdust against the warmer months, concealed inside a small tin deed box that had been thrust beneath a loose flagstone and wrapped, for further protection against the damp in a covering of oilcloth. Harcourt, Bellamy, Holmes, and I proceeded thither at once, and found the box precisely as described, its contents undisturbed since its discovery. Beside the writ itself, folded within the same wrapping, lay a written confession, signed in a hand I recognised at once as Clara Fenwick's. She admitted in terms that struck me as painfully direct for one so young that she had taken the writ from Bellamy's dispatch case out of gratitude towards Sir Claudius, who had, some years before, intervened to save her father from a debtor's prison, that she had entered the library during the confusion of that stormy night by means of a duplicate key she had long possessed, unknown to any other member of the household, that she had concealed the true document in the ice-house against a more convenient season for its destruction, and that she had in the meanwhile burned a false paper in the dining-room grate to mislead whatever inquiry might follow. Clara herself, summoned to the library to confirm this account, stood pale and trembling before us, and repeated in a voice scarcely above a whisper the substance of what her confession had already declared. I own that I found the sight of her distress difficult to witness, and more than once during that interview I caught myself wishing the matter concluded, whatever injustice might lie concealed beneath so convenient a resolution. The circumstances, moreover, appeared to close about her with a completeness that left little room, upon the surface, for doubt. Among her sewing materials, carefully hidden but not carefully enough, Harcourt discovered a small disc of wax bearing the unmistakable impression of a key, evidence, as he triumphantly declared, that she had contrived the means of opening the safe without the knowledge of either keyholder. Her damp cuff, which Holmes had noted 2 days before, was explained at a stroke by the ice she must have handled in preparing her hiding-place. The missing length of surgical cord taken from Dr. Merrow's bag she claimed to have used in lowering the deed-box from the library window by way of the ventilating hatch, before the heaviest fall of snow had rendered such an operation impossible. And the curious rectangular depression beneath the sill, which had so exercised Holmes's attention, was accounted for by the brief interval during which the box had rested upon the snow before being drawn up again into the passage and carried out to its final hiding-place. I confess that I, for one, found the case complete. Every particular that had puzzled us, the ash, the ribbon, the scratch upon the sill, the reversed fire screen, the torn page of the timetable, seemed now to fall into its place about this single confession, as the scattered pieces of a puzzle resolve themselves at last into a coherent picture once the final piece is set. Harcourt, understandably, regarded the matter as concluded in every particular, and began at once to speak of the formalities that must attend so unhappy a business. Holmes, to my very great surprise, offered no challenge whatever to this conclusion. He examined the deed-box, the oilcloth, and the confession itself with every appearance of careful attention, and pronounced himself, when Harcourt pressed him for an opinion, entirely satisfied with the inspector's reasoning. He went so far as to compliment Harcourt upon the thoroughness of his inquiry, a courtesy that struck me, even at the time, as somewhat more generous than the inspector's own methods had strictly earned, and advised only that no formal arrest be made until the roads had reopened and the matter could be laid properly before the appropriate authorities, a suggestion to which Sir Claudius, anxious above all things to spare the household further distress, readily agreed. I own that Holmes's readiness to concede the point troubled me more than any argument he might have raised against it. In all our years together, I had rarely known him to abandon a line of inquiry so abruptly, still less to praise a solution he had not himself reached by his own method. And though I said nothing of my misgivings at the time, I resolved to watch him closely through whatever remained of that curious day. My vigilance was rewarded, though not until the evening was well advanced. I found him in the library, the recovered writ spread upon the table before him, beneath the light of a single lamp, his pocket lens held close above the paper, with an intentness that recalled nothing so much as the attitude he wore in the earliest hours of a case, rather than the closing hours of one already solved. I observed as I drew nearer that his attention was directed neither to the writing upon the document, nor to its seals, nor to the signature that authenticated it, but to a single narrow fold that ran directly across its centre. A fold no different, so far as my own untrained eye could discern, from 100 such creases that any legal paper might acquire in the ordinary course of its handling. "You're not satisfied, Holmes," said I, breaking a silence that had lasted some minutes. He did not look up at once, but continued to move the lens slowly along the length of that single fold, as a man might trace with his finger the outline of some half-remembered word. "I have told Harcourt that I am satisfied," said he at length, in a tone I had learned over the years to distinguish very carefully from agreement. "It does not follow, my dear Watson, that I have told him the truth." Chapter 8. The Triumph of the False Solution. By the following morning, the confidence of the household in Clara's guilt had settled into something very like relief, and I confess that the change in the general atmosphere of Blackthorn Hall was remarkable to witness. Sir Claudius, whose earlier bearing had been that of a man labouring under suspicion he could not shake off, now moved among us with the easy manner of one restored to his proper place, and went so far as to offer, with an air of magnanimity I found faintly distasteful, to engage counsel on the unfortunate girl's behalf. Lady Honora wept openly over what she termed Clara's sacrifice, and spoke of her in terms that struck me as curiously theatrical, as a young woman who had given all for gratitude's sake. Rusk, for his part, withdrew to the study and began, with a briskness that seemed to me almost indecent given the circumstances, the preparation of statements for the constabulary. Holmes moved through this atmosphere of settled conviction, like a man content to let a current carry him, offering neither contradiction nor encouragement, and I own that his passivity puzzled me a good deal more than any display of active suspicion could have done. It was not until the middle of that morning that I began to understand the purpose behind his apparent acquiescence. He asked Clara, with every appearance of merely completing the record for Bellamy's satisfaction, whether she would consent to demonstrate the manner in which she had folded the writ before placing it within the tin deed box, a request so natural given the circumstances of her confession that no one present thought to question it. Clara, though visibly reluctant, took up a sheet of blank paper of similar size and, under Holmes's quiet direction, folded it twice across its width and once again along its length, producing a small, thick packet such as might indeed be fitted conveniently within a box no larger than a cigar case. I thought nothing of this at the time beyond a natural curiosity as to Holmes's purpose in requesting it. But that evening, when he laid the true writ once more before me upon the library table, he directed my attention to a discrepancy that I confess had entirely escaped my own observation. The document recovered from the ice-house, Watson, bears but a single strong horizontal fold, nothing more. Compare this with the demonstration Miss Fenwick gave us this morning, in which she folded her sheet not once but 3 times, precisely as any person must who wishes to fit so large a paper into so small a box. The writ before us shows no trace whatever of those additional folds. I turned the document over in my own hands and saw that he had spoken truly. The single crease across its centre stood alone, unaccompanied by any lesser folds that might have testified to its passage into that narrow hiding place. There is a second matter, more conclusive still, Holmes continued, drawing the lamp nearer and indicating with the tip of his pencil the place where the court's embossed seal crossed directly over that single fold. You will observe that the seal, though it lies athwart the crease, shows no crack, no fracture in its wax, no sign whatever that it has been bent along with the paper beneath it. Now, Watson, a seal of this kind is brittle by its very nature. It must be, for the security of the document depends upon that very brittleness, which renders any tampering visible. Had this paper been folded after the seal was affixed, the wax must inevitably have cracked along the line of the fold. Since it has not done so, the fold itself must have existed before ever the seal was applied, which is to say, Watson, that this paper was folded at some time before it ever became, in the eyes of the law, the writ that Bellamy carried from London. The conclusion, once stated, seemed to me so plain that I wondered I had not perceived it myself. Then the document in the ice-house is not the writ Bellamy placed in his dispatch case, but a substitute, prepared in advance by some hand that anticipated the need for it, and folded, I think, at the same time and in the same manner as the false paper burned in the dining room grate 2 nights ago. We are dealing, Watson, not with a single deception hastily improvised, but with a scheme conceived and provisioned well before the theft it was designed to conceal. There remained, moreover, a second inconsistency, which Holmes had discovered that same evening while the household still congratulated itself upon a mystery resolved. The oilcloth in which the deed-box had been wrapped, though supposedly exposed to the chill of the ice-house for the better part of 2 nights, showed upon its inner surface no trace of the damp that so protracted a concealment must inevitably have produced. And clinging to one corner, scarcely visible save under close examination, was a small deposit of candle grease still soft enough to retain the faint warmth of recent handling. The box, Watson, was not hidden 2 nights ago at all. It was placed in that ice-house only shortly before Trent discovered it yesterday morning. Placed there, I'm now persuaded, by someone who wished the discovery to appear the culmination of a concealment already accomplished, when in truth it was nothing of the kind. I sat for some moments in silence, turning these revelations over in my mind, and found myself troubled by a question that pressed upon me with increasing urgency. But Holmes, if the confession is false and the writ recovered is not the true document at all, then Clara herself must have known this when she signed her name to that paper. Why should she confess to a crime she did not commit, and confirm before us all a falsehood she must have understood to be exposed the moment anyone examined the document with care? That, my dear Watson, said Holmes, folding the writ carefully and returning it to its case, is a question I intend to put to her directly, though I think I can already guess a good part of the answer. She has agreed to bear a burden that was never rightly hers, but I do not yet know for whose sake she has agreed to bear it. That is the thread which remains to be drawn, and I confess I have grown very curious indeed to see where its unwinding will lead us. He said no more that night upon the subject, though I observed, as we parted for our respective rooms, that his manner had taken on that particular quiet intensity which I had learned, over so many years of friendship, to recognise as the surest sign that the true solution lay now almost within his grasp, withheld for the present only until the moment of its fullest and most telling disclosure. Chapter 9. The Cord, the Screen, and the Concealed Writ. Holmes gave orders the following morning that the entire household should assemble in the library at 11 o'clock, a summons delivered with such quiet authority that not even Sir Claudius, master though he was of that house, thought to question it. I confess that I approached the hour with no little anticipation, for I had seen in my friend's bearing, since our conversation of the previous evening, the settled calm of a man who has at last assembled every piece of a difficult puzzle and awaits only the moment of its display. They came in slowly, and took their places about the room with the uneasy stiffness of persons who suspect, without quite knowing why, that the ground beneath their feet is less secure than they had believed it to be that morning. Harcourt stood near the door, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished by the events of the past 2 days, though he had not yet abandoned his conviction that the matter stood substantially resolved. "I promised Inspector Harcourt a full account," Holmes began, "and I shall give it, though I fear it will please no one in this room so little as those who believed themselves, until this moment, safely beyond the reach of the law's more serious displeasure." He turned first to the conspiracy of delay, which he had already described to me in its outline, and set it now before the assembled company with a precision that left no room for further evasion. Lady Honora, Clara, Dr. Merrow, and Trent, he said, had agreed among themselves, out of a loyalty to Sir Claudius that did them more credit as a sentiment than as a judgment, to contrive the appearance that the writ had vanished from a locked room in the hope of gaining time enough to remove the tapestries beyond the court's reach before the truth of the matter could be established. Miss Fenwick carried a block of ice, wrapped against the warmth of the drawing-room, along the disused east staircase to the passage above this very library. Dr. Merrow's cord, drawn from his own surgical stores, was threaded through the ventilating hatch that Mr. Trent had opened for the purpose, and made fast to a small weighted box. That box was lowered, by means of the cord, to rest for a time upon the snow beneath the window, before the heaviest fall of the night had yet begun, As the ice that supported it slowly melted, the box settled deeper into the softening drift, and the snow that followed completed an illusion of undisturbed ground that even my own examination very nearly accepted at its face value. He paused, and I saw more than one face in that room grow pale at hearing, spoken aloud and in such careful order, a scheme each conspirator had believed known only to the small circle that had contrived it. The false paper burned in the dining room grate, and the page torn from the household timetable were intended only to delay and confuse whatever inquiry might follow, nothing more. It was never the intention of this conspiracy that the true writ should vanish beyond recovery. Once the tapestries had been safely removed, I have no doubt the document would have been restored to its proper place, and the whole affair allowed to pass as an unaccountable and ultimately harmless mystery. "But someone," said Holmes, and his voice, though it did not rise, seemed to gather about it a stillness that held the whole room fast. "Someone in this house saw that scheme taking shape, and understood at once that it offered a cover far more valuable than any of its authors had intended. That person was Mr. Edmund Rusk. Rusk, who had stood throughout this recital with a composure I had admired, even while suspecting it must eventually fail him, now went very white indeed, though he said nothing. As Sir Claudius's secretary, Holmes continued, Mr. Rusk possessed access to the correspondence in which the whole matter of the disputed debt was discussed, and had learned some days before Bellamy's arrival that a writ of attachment was likely to be served. He prepared, in advance, a convincing substitute document, the very paper we later recovered from the ice house, folded and creased to resemble the original, though folded, as I've shown, before ever a seal was applied to it. When the conspirators' own scheme created, during that unwatched quarter hour, an opportunity no one had thought to guard against, Rusk removed the true writ from the dispatch case and put his substitute in its place, intending that the household's own deception should be blamed for whatever discrepancies might later be discovered. He did not conceal the true document outside the house, as the others had done with their false box of snow and ice. He concealed it, Watson, within arm's reach of us all, in the one place a searching eye is least inclined to look twice, inside the hollow frame of that brass fire screen. Holmes crossed to the hearth as he spoke, and with a small tool drew away the screen's removable back panel, disclosing a narrow cavity within, from which he now withdrew, with something very near to satisfaction, the true writ of attachment, its single fold and unbroken seal exactly as Bellamy himself would presently confirm them to be. The soot upon the wrong face of that screen, which first drew my attention upon the very night of the theft, told me it had been turned about. Turned, I now believe, so that its hollow back might be presented toward the wall, the more conveniently for Rusk's purpose. The lowered curtain tassel had caught and been disturbed as he moved the screen into its new position, and the scratch upon the sill, which I had at first supposed connected with the theft itself, was in truth nothing more than a mark left by the conspirators' own cord, drawn taut across the stone in the course of their separate and, as it happens, entirely innocent operation. He turned then to Rusk directly. "Your motive, I think, was not loyalty to Sir Claudius, whatever face you may have shown this household. You had, some weeks since, purchased through an agent a portion of the very debt now in dispute, a fact your own private correspondence, which Inspector Harcourt will no doubt wish to examine at his leisure, establishes beyond question. Should the writ vanish permanently, and the tapestries be moved beyond the court's reach, you stood to profit twice over, once by exposing Sir Claudius's evasion to the injured party, and again by acquiring at a price your own knowledge would allow you to dictate, the very property he sought to save. The true writ kept safely in your possession gave you a hold over every soul in this room." The final proof, Holmes added, lay in the very ink stains that had first drawn his notice during his earlier examination of the household. Rusk had worn, while handling his prepared substitute, a thumb guard of the kind used by clerks engaged in sorting rather than composing correspondence, hence the clean thumb amid ink-stained fingers. And beneath that guard, when Harcourt at last examined it, was found a trace of the same distinctive blue paper fibre that had been recovered from the grate. Rusk, confronted at once with the recovered writ, the record of his secret purchase, and the small but damning evidence of the thumb guard, abandoned at last the composure he had maintained through every earlier examination, and confessed the whole of his design with a bitterness that seemed, in that final collapse, very like relief. Clara, weeping openly now that the burden of her false confession had been lifted from her, admitted that Lady Honora had urged the deception upon her, believing that a young companion's confession, followed by a plea for mercy, would draw far less severe consequences than an inquiry into the conspiracy of the household entire. Chapter 10. The Thaw at Blackthorn. The weather broke that same night, as though some long-suspended judgment had at last been permitted to fall, and I woke upon the 4th morning of our stay at Blackthorn Hall to a light I had almost forgotten, a clear, pale sunlight striking full upon the frozen moor beyond my window, and more welcome still to my ear, the steady dripping of water from the eaves, where icicles that had hung rigid for 3 days now surrendered themselves, drop by drop, to the returning warmth. By noon the road had opened sufficiently for a party of officers to make their way up from the county town, summoned by a rider Trent had sent forward at first light. Rusk was taken into custody upon charges of theft, fraud, and attempted extortion, and I confess that I watched his departure from the hall with rather less satisfaction than the resolution of so intricate a mystery might have been expected to afford me. There is little triumph, I have found, in seeing exposed a man whose cleverness, however wickedly employed, one cannot help but recognise as considerable. The others of the household fared, upon the whole, more gently than their conduct might perhaps have warranted. Bellamy, once the true writ had been restored to his keeping and its authenticity established beyond any further question, showed himself disposed to a leniency that did him credit, and recognising that no property had in fact been removed before the law's proper claim upon it could be asserted, he undertook to represent to the authorities that the household's cooperation, however belated, had materially assisted in the recovery of the document, and that the lesser conspiracy of delay might, in the circumstances, be dealt with as a matter for civil rather than criminal reproach. Sir Claudius, for his part, surrendered the tapestries without further protest, and abandoned, with what seemed to me a genuine and not merely a prudent contrition, the proud insistence that family honour might be preserved through means the law could not sanction. Claire was spared any prosecution for her false confession, once Holmes had laid before the authorities the full circumstances of the pressure that had been brought to bear upon her. A young woman of slender means and slighter influence, persuaded by an older and more forceful will that her sacrifice would spare an entire household, from consequences she had been given every reason to believe far graver than they in fact proved to be. Lady Honora, to her credit, did not seek to evade the responsibility Holmes's account had placed upon her, but came forward of her own accord to acknowledge that the scheme of delay and the design that Clara should bear its blame had both originated with herself, while Dr. Merrow and Mr. Trent, each questioned in turn, expressed a shame that struck me as entirely unfeigned at having mistaken, as Merrow himself phrased it, loyalty to a friend for duty toward the truth. Our own departure was arranged for that same afternoon, the road being judged passable as far as the railway station, and I own that I felt no small relief as our sleigh at last drew away from beneath those grey gables where so much had, in so short a space, been both concealed and disclosed. The estate, as we left it, no longer wore the aspect of a place besieged. The silence that had lain so heavily upon it through 3 days and nights of snow had broken now into the ordinary sounds of a working household restored to the world. The distant grinding of wheels upon a road no longer buried, the calling of men clearing drifts from the gates, the rush of meltwater finding its way at last to the streams below. I remarked to Holmes, as we settled ourselves for the journey southward, that the whole affair had turned, when one came to examine it closely, upon matters that might have seemed almost too slight for serious notice. A fold in a sheet of paper, a smear of soot upon the wrong face of a fire screen. "It is generally so, Watson," he replied, settling back against the cushions with the particular ease of a man whose mind, having laboured hard, permits itself at last a measure of repose. "The eye receives the truth a great deal sooner than the mind consents to accept it. We had all of us looked upon that fire screen, upon that folded paper, before ever I remarked upon them, Harcourt no less than you or I. The difficulty lies never in the seeing, but in resisting the pull of an explanation that satisfies before it has earned the right to do so. A convenient theory, once embraced, blinds a man more completely than any darkness could, for he ceases even to look for what might contradict it. And Clara's confession very nearly succeeded, for that very reason. It very nearly succeeded, because it offered Harcourt, and I confess for a moment, very nearly offered me, precisely the resolution that every circumstance seemed to invite. A frightened girl, a plausible motive, a recovered document. What more could an honest investigator ask? And yet a single fold, examined with sufficient care, was enough to unmake the whole edifice. I have long believed, Watson, that coincidence will satisfy the careless observer, and that confession, however sincerely offered, may deceive even the most confident if it is not tested against the mute and unpersuadable evidence of the physical world. There is no room so thoroughly locked, no explanation so neatly closed, that it does not yield some crack to the man who declines to take its walls upon trust. I have set down this narrative, as I have set down so many others, chiefly for the pleasure of preserving some record of a friendship that has furnished the better part of whatever understanding I possess of human motive and human folly. But I confess that this case, more than most, has remained with me as a lesson in the particular discipline that governed my friend's whole method of thought, that an enclosed room contains, in truth, no impossibility beyond that which an unquestioned assumption has itself created, and that the observer who refuses to mistake the first plausible story for the last necessary truth will, sooner or later, be rewarded with the truth entire. As our train drew away at last from the small country station, carrying us southward through a landscape already surrendering its white burden to the returning spring, I glanced across at Holmes, who had closed his eyes against the pale afternoon light, and reflected not for the first time upon my very great good fortune in having been permitted, through so many singular adventures, to walk beside so remarkable a mind.